New Gen Gamers.
It's interesting you say that because whenever the 5200 came out, it was originally supposed to compete directly with the Intellivision.
Yeah.
And eventually ended up, they set their sights on the Intellivision as their main competitor, and it ended up moving to ColecoVision as their main competitor.
Because Coleco came onto the market way after this was designed and ready to go.
But once again, using a shady business deal where you could play the 2600 games, the Atari ones that were already released, and a lot of people had their library stocked up with 2600 games, and with the 5200, you'd have to start all over. New games, new system, nothing to play that's backwards compatibility, and we see in even the early stages of the console wars, backwards compatibility is a huge selling point to anything. And it's funny that it took them, so many years to get back to that. I remember hearing, not to go too much into this, but when the GameCube came out, there were early rumors that it would have backwards compatibility with the older systems, and it took till we saw that. And really, everyone has jumped on board this idea. And we're seeing it starting here right in the 80s, although not directly tied into the consoles it should have been in. But it's a huge deal.
Well, back then, one of the interesting points on that was that since Atari actually used off-the-shelf parts to make the 2600, it was actually mostly legal for these companies to do it. So they took advantage of it right away.
There you go.
And started utilizing backwards compatibility for 2600. Intellivision did it, Coleco did it, and even Atari did it with their own system.
And I think it's important that we also mention, because we've talked about the controller so much now, the Atari 5200 was interesting because it had 4 controller ports. Well, there was a version of it that had 4 controller ports. And also, we mentioned the trackball controller. That was kind of like, if you've ever used a trackball, it's kind of like a mouse upside down that you just spin the ball in place. But it does help on quite a few games, as we played Super Breakout already. It would have been a lot easier to play that game. And also, they were thinking about releasing a paddle controller and an updated self-centering controller, which would have been very useful, because the problem we're running into this 5200 controller is it doesn't self-center. And what I mean by that is if you go left, you stay left.
It just feels loose.
It does, and if it would have, I don't know.
Hence the problem we're having with this game.
Yeah, and if
the tight turns aren't possible.
And if it would have been back in place, it would have centered itself. Everything would have been easier. Think the original Pac-Man arcade joystick. The idea that it recenters itself on a spring. This does not do that, and it makes it so hard to maneuver yourself. It takes a large learning curve to get used to it.
And we haven't said much about this game yet, but this is Defender, one of the games we actually showed you on the 2600 Console Wars. But look at the version we're showing you right here. What was that, self-destruct button?
So now we're seeing the graphics being pushed. Not as much as...
This looks a lot closer to the arcade original than the 2600 version.
Absolutely.
And you did a lot of glitching in and out in the 2600 version. Here you have a nice, clean ship.
And also...
big enemies.
Yeah, and we're seeing another reason the Atari 5200 should have succeeded: arcade ports. This system is loaded with arcade ports. Here's a classic, but at the same time, there wasn't so much original content created. 2600 had a lot of original games. Sure, most of them weren't particularly good, but they were available. This is a system that was more like the arcade at home idea.
Yeah, a lot of the right before the crash systems pushed that. Coleco and the 5200 both were trying to capture that arcade at home experience.
Well, I think we've had enough of Defender. I think we should move on to our next title.
Yes, we're going to move on to something that did utilize the number pad in Star Raiders. Just died. Ron is refusing now that he's got it. Alright, we're going to have to shut you off.
Now here's a game that actually uses the keypad to its full extent, and when it was on the Atari 2600 they actually released an extra keypad peripheral specifically for this game that came in it in a bigger box and everything.
And we are checking out the Star Raiders right now.
We are rating stars.
And rating them well. Let's continue with our discussion of the Atari 5200. Kind of where it began, the hardware aspect of it, if you'd like to hit on that, Ron.
Well, the hardware was decent. It was more powerful than the Intellivision. it had more fluid graphics. The Intellivision was better than the Atari 2600, but visually just kind of couldn't do a whole lot of active action, whereas this, as you can see, we have these active star systems. Looking at Defender, things moved quickly, and there's a lot of things going on the screen. So the games are pretty active, but again, the ColecoVision came out just months after this system and at a lower price and just crushed it right out of the gate. If the ColecoVision hadn't come along, the Atari 5200 versus the Intellivision would have been a lot fiercer, but the Coleco really came in and had
just
superior...
Stole the show,
had a decent price, awesome graphics, some really great arcade games, and so when we get into that game, you'll see why it really just came in and dominated for the short period that it was there.
And
but
speaking of the price, though, like you said, what the 5200 we found retailed between $270 and $330.
Yeah, so it came out at a pretty high price tag, and the ColecoVision came out at $199, $199 US. Yeah, hey, that's a great selling point, and comparatively, it was cheaper and looked better, and so this system was dead in the water. It came out in '82, and by '84, the video game industry was virtually dead in America.
And I want to speak a little bit about the interesting part. The hardware for this system, the 5200, was based off the 400, 800 computers that Atari had been releasing. Then they made a series of home computers to compete directly with Apple and the other computer companies, the 8-bit computers at the time during the 80s. And the hardware was almost identical. The only difference was the games were pretty much the same release for the home computer and the home console, but the home computer had a keyboard, and so you couldn't have the games compatible with each other, even though they were pretty much the exact same games. So whatever you had for your home computer would not play on the home console. But
yeah, so there's a whole line of Atari 400 and 800 games out there that are mostly ports from the 2600 and 5200, but are not compatible.
Yeah, and this series of computers that they were competing with Apple with and other companies at
Commodore,
the time.
Everyone that was coming up at that time, Texas Instruments.
Yeah, we had the Commodore PET or PET, and then Texas Instruments or the TRS-80. And this series of computers ran to 1992, whenever it was finally shelved. But I think it's very interesting to see that they kind of the same comparable. I could compare it to the Xbox with their Windows operating system. It's the same idea, and we saw a lot of home computers during the 80s. There was just a slew of those, and you had your options out there, but they didn't do much. So
yeah, it was a decent computer system, but at the time they created it, there were so many other better things on the market that just outperformed it in the marketplace time and again. So right at this time, Atari sort of hit a death knell in all regards, because the 2600 was starting to wane. This is around the time they released the craptacular versions of Pac-Man and E.T. that they overproduced and basically glutted the market with those and drove the price of all those games down. This system came out at a ridiculous price tag and didn't sell, and so they were losing money hand over fist. The computer systems didn't catch on, so they started losing money there. So by 1984, they were pretty much done. Mm-hmm. And Warner Communications owned all of Atari, so it was pretty much valueless by that point. They were losing over $1 million a day.
That's a huge hemorrhage, too.
Yeah, that's basically being stabbed in the stomach and hoping you make it through the night, you know?
Exactly.
If you think ColecoVision plays all Atari cartridges...
You mean it can't?
Here's Pac-Man on ColecoVision. But here's Pac-Man for the Atari 5200 Super System.
Now you're talking.
And it doesn't work on ColecoVision.
But won't their adapter?
It won't play Super System cartridges.
Not pole position?
Not this pole position.
Not centipede?
Not this centipede. Only on the Atari 5200 Super System.
But aren't they hard to find?
They're everywhere.
Everywhere?
The Atari 5200 Super System.
New Gen Gamers, Duck Wensel.